All right. Lauren asked me if I was going to introduce myself, or they just going to have to listen to a stranger tonight. So I guess you just going to have to listen to a stranger tonight. We are limited on time and I want to get into this study. I am thankful for this lesson. When I was thinking about, when I first got the idea, when Alex and I were talking about this, and he gave me the topic, talking about Saul joining the team, I thought, hey, Acts chapter 9, Saul became a Christian. Saul was going to go on the road to Damascus, all this, but I got to digging into this, and I really enjoyed this study. And what I want to do is, an outset of this, when I think about Saul, and I'm going to do this back and forth. We're going to say Saul sometimes, and I'm going to say Paul sometimes, but we're talking about the same guy. All right? Saul of Tarsus, Paul the Apostle. And when I think about Paul, he's one of those characters of the Bible, and I don't like to use that term character loosely, and I'm not trying to, but he's one of those people that we read about in the Bible that I kind of hold in a very high esteem. He is an outstanding individual in biblical study, biblical history. And what's one of the reasons why you think that he is such an outstanding individual? This is a Bible class situation, so if you want to answer, that's fine. What's something to you that makes Paul the Apostle stand out as an outstanding individual? Dedication. Oh, he was totally dedicated to the work, wasn't he? He was dedicated before he became a Christian, and he was dedicated after as well, and that's a great example of it. What else? The background, and we're going to talk about that. That's one of the things I want to do. And his background is so diverse. He's just an outstanding individual. And much of the New Testament, of course, was written by him. Just think about how much we would be missing had he not been a disciple, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So, well, that's a difficult question, because if he hadn't become a Christian, if he hadn't been an apostle for Jesus, Jesus would have had someone else to do it, right? He would have made sure that was going to take place. But he did, and he was the man for the job. Jesus chose him himself, as he did with all of the apostles. Every apostle was specifically chosen by Jesus. Even Matthias, of course, well, they cast lots for him. Didn't we read that in the end of Acts chapter 1? Yes, but God was behind that, and he said, "This is my God." Matthias is going to be numbered with the 12, or the 11. And so now here he's chosen. We see this in Acts chapter 9, verses 15 and 16, where Jesus says, "I've chosen him for a specific purpose. He's going to be an apostle for me. He's going to be a disciple for me, and he's going to preach to kings, to Gentiles, to kings, and to the children of Israel." So who does that leave out? Nobody. He's going to preach to all. But his specific, that first one is very important and specific. He was the apostle to the Gentiles, to take the gospel to the Gentiles. But was he the first one to take the gospel to a Gentile? Yes or no? No. Who was? Peter. Acts chapter 10. He went to Cornelius' house. But the idea behind this still holds true. This is what he's chosen to do. Now, when we think about him, he was born, of course, we're talking about his background. We're going to do this by way of introduction. We'll talk about his background. And his background, what is one of the things that helps make him so much even more fascinating, the diversity of it we was talking about earlier. But he was born to a predominant Jewish family. We see that over in Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 5, where he was born as into this Jewish family. His father was a Pharisee, and he himself was as well. And so that would be a predominant family in that day and age, Jewish background. You want to talk about your pedigree? He said, "I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews." He was also of what tribe? If you read Philippians 3:5, you know. Of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, what was his name? His name was Saul. Does that ring a bell to anybody? There's another great Saul in the Bible, isn't there? King Saul, the first king of Israel. Guess what tribe he was from? Benjamin. His father, Kish, was a Benjamite, and you see that in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 and following. But his hometown, and that's an interesting thing, his hometown, Saul of Tarsus, it was a city in Cilicia. And you see this over in Acts chapter 21, verse 39. Paul said he was from Tarsus. The old King James Version says, no mean city. You know what that means? They weren't rough there. They didn't have gangs and violence. No, that was not what he meant. mean carries an idea as this is not an obscure city. This is not some insignificant city. It was a very populated city, a very well-known city, and it had boasted itself of having a large. It was a large harbor there, and a lot of commerce and things of that nature would take place. Tarsus was built by the Assyrians sometime around the 7th century. So the Assyrians built this. It has a great history behind it. It has a lot of culture. When you have a great harbor there, that's going to introduce a lot of commerce, of course, but it's also going to introduce a lot of culture. And these cultures coming together, what does that bring about? Problems. Well, that's true, but that wasn't what I was talking about. It brings about affluence, and affluence brings about education and things of this nature. Tarsus, of course, was a city in Cilicia, but it was also a Roman province, and Rome was big on education. And they had a lot of education in that city. Greek philosophy and education was promoted by the Roman rule that was in that city at that time. Now, this was an interesting little tidbit about Tarsus. It's believed to be that this was the first place where Cleopatra met Mark Antony for the first time. That would have been around 41 BC. So what we're talking about is a city that has a lot of culture. You know, cities have some claim to fame, right? Tupelo, what's its claim to fame? That's it. but it brings people all the time. You can't drive down Main Street over by Tupelo Hardware. Any time of the year, any time of the day, you're going to find somebody out there taking a picture of something, right? It brings people in, and it's what its claim to fame is. We understand that. Well, if this is a place where Cleopatra met Mark Antony for the first time, that's a claim to fame, isn't it? There's wealth and commerce there. That's something that brought claim to fame as well. But when you think about Saul, we think about an educated man. He was one of the most educated of all of the apostles. Now, there's some others that we don't have a whole lot of history on, but nevertheless, we know that he was a very well-educated man. And growing up in a city like that, that makes sense. But part of his education wasn't just Greek philosophy or Greek literature. It wasn't just those things that was going on. He also had an education that was tied to his background as being a Jew. Now, when you think about that, his ancestry having an effect on that, he embraced, maybe a better word, he embodied the zeal of the Pharisees. What do we know about the Pharisees? Oh, they're just made laws that God didn't make. Yeah, and they're condemned for that a lot in the scriptures. But do you know how the Pharisees began? The Pharisees began as a group trying to keep what we might call today liberalism, spiritually speaking, from interfering in God's word. They were trying to keep pure Judaism. They were longing for and looking for the Messiah to come and hoping to hold true to the word of God. Now, they went too far in that, as people tend to do, and started elevating tradition above that of the law of God. But apart from that, hold on to that idea that here are people who are looking for and longing for the Messiah to come. Now, what that evolved into in the days of Jesus' life, in the days of Saul as well, what that had evolved into is they were looking for Messiah to come, but to give them freedom from Rome, not freedom from sin. That's one of the reasons they messed up so badly. They were looking for a physical deliverance instead of a spiritual deliverance. And Jesus is Messiah, Christ. He came to free man from sin. He didn't always take man out of the difficult situations that the physical life brought upon them, did he? Jesus himself didn't even shield his own life from the physical hardships, did he? He embraced them and took them for you and for me. But Greek language, literature, philosophy, and that Judaic theology was definitely a part of his life. Now, he was sent to Jerusalem, we know, to continue in that education, and probably did so at a young age. He was sent to Jerusalem to study under the feet of a prominent teacher, Gamaliel the elder. That's where he would get his vast understanding of the Jewish teachings, the Jewish law, the Talmud, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and all the things that went along with the law of Moses that he was trying to hold so adherently to, and that helps to set the stage for what's going to take place in the passages there in chapter 7, the end of chapter 7, chapter 8, leading into his conversion. It's recorded in chapter 9 of the book of Acts. His whole world would be turned upside down and changed at the meeting of Jesus. That was a powerful thought that I had when I was looking at this. How Jesus changes lives. That's a great study, and we can talk about that. But how many people who claim to know Jesus, they claim to love Jesus and profess Christ's name and call themselves Christians, but never actually have a change in their life? You have to ask the question, did they really meet Jesus? Do we really want to meet Jesus? That's a sobering question. If you were to put yourself in Saul's position, who thinks he thinks of himself as this man of God, he did everything that he did. How? What did he say about that? I did everything up to this day in what? Good conscience. What do you think that conscience? My conscience is good with God. How many people have told you, well, I'm good. God and I, we're like this. But you're not living according to His Word. How does that work? So I think about this. Here is this man who met Jesus, and he had everything going for him. I mean, he thought he's serving God faithfully. He would have, let's just be honest, he would have been affluent. He would have been a wealthy person. The Pharisees, they would have been wealthy people. They would have been the upper echelon of the society in that culture. And he's going to throw it all away. Hear me now. After meeting Jesus once. Truly meeting Jesus once, he was willing to throw all of that away. That's the power of Jesus, yes. But it also speaks to the heart of this man that we're studying tonight. That's an honest and good heart. He sees the truth, he embraces it. Now, some say that maybe 2 Corinthians 5:16 proves that Saul had met Jesus prior to the road to Damascus. Let's look at that passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 16. He says, wherefore, henceforth, know we no man after the flesh, yea, though we have known Christ after the flesh, yet now henceforth know we him no more. So some say, see, he said, we know Christ in the flesh. Well, when he met Jesus, he had already died, was buried, and had resurrected, right? So maybe he's including himself. I'm not going to split a church over it, as the saying goes, but I don't think that really proves, and there's not enough, and other commentaries also say there's not really enough evidence to prove that he met Jesus. There's another way of looking at that. What is the other way of looking at that? Mankind saw Jesus in the flesh, but we don't know him now. We don't see him in the flesh now. We see him through the teachings and through the word of those who did see him, as John would say in 1 John chapter 1, how he handled him, how he heard him and spoke with him and all of those things. And as Paul would say to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15, seen of over 500 at once, right? So there were people who saw him in the flesh, walked with him, the other apostles. Paul saw him clearly on the road to Damascus, though. We know that. But nevertheless, it's an interesting little tidbit of information. As we consider his response to Jesus that day on the road to Damascus, though, it gives me a little bit of trouble with that. Lord, who art thou? Or who art thou, Lord? And Jesus says to him, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. And so there was an introduction. And I don't even believe, and we'll talk about that in a few moments, I don't even believe that when he said Lord that he was thinking God. He was thinking more so at that point of someone who's in authority over me, someone who I'm inferior to. This light's blinding me. This voice of authority is coming, and he's bowing down to that. That's the idea of Lord, I believe he's displaying in that text. Now, we're looking at Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and following, and we're going to look at a record of Saul becoming one of God's team. And this is a great story of one turning from the persecutor to the persecuted, as we can see that from Acts chapter 7, verses 58 through Acts 8:3. Remember, in the end of Acts chapter 7, they're stoning Stephen. Stephen had preached this. Really and truly, all Stephen did was told them their history. They should have known this in the first place, but they didn't like the end of that account, how that they had crucified the Son of God. And they gnashed on him with their teeth. They're gritting their teeth. They take him out and they stone him. But it says there toward the end that they laid, this is the first actual introduction that we have of Saul of Tarsus. They laid their coats at a young man's feet named Saul. And he was consenting unto this death. He was giving his stamp of approval. He would be, as we would say today, he's over there saying, get him. I'm all with you on this. Get him. I'll hold your coats. If I didn't have to hold your coats, I'd throw a rock myself. That's how he was about this. And we'll see that a little bit more, too, in some of the wording as we get over in chapter 9. And he continues that in chapter 8. Saul was consenting unto his death, and at that time, he had great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout regions of Judea, Samaria, except the apostles. And so he went from traveling on this, in Acts chapter 9, as he's going to Damascus, he went from traveling some 135 to 140 miles, depending on which commentary you look at. But the distance from Jerusalem to Damascus is about 135 to 140 miles. He went from traveling 135 miles with letters from the high priest to imprison Christians to traveling some 2,485 miles, bringing the gospel to save people from their sins. Now, I know that he did a little more traveling than just that road to Damascus in his persecution against the church, but I just thought that was quite interesting to look at that vast difference that's going to change in his life. We said earlier that Jesus chose Saul to be his apostle to the Gentiles. Look at those passages again, verses 15 and 16. Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. I can't help but think back to Jesus' words to his disciples. Often he would be told by people, I'll follow you wherever you want to go. Birds of the air have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Are you sure you're ready to take this one? He told his closest friends, his disciples, you will be hated of all men for my name's sake. He that endureth to the end, the same shall be saved. If you just stop at that first phrase, you'll be hated of all men for my name's sake. Who wants to sign me up? It's hard, isn't it? Think that way, but that's our reality, just like it was theirs. It's even more so then, and it could be some of those things could happen even more so for us in the future. We don't know. All I know is we need to be faithful to God. So let's note how Saul went from being number one antagonist to a first-rate teammate for Christ. I mean, one above level of even measuring how valuable. MVP? Yes, there's Saul. MVP. First of all, let's note Saul's vendetta. Now, these V words didn't originate with me, but it helps me to break down this section. First of all, Saul's vendetta. This is verses 1 and 2 of Acts chapter 9. Go ahead and put your ribbon down in Acts 9. That's where we're going to be for the rest of the study. And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. Breathing out threatening. Saul's background, we just talked about, all of that education that he had, all of that ancestry that he had, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee, as touching the law, a Pharisee, blameless. That caused him to literally loathe and despise what he saw as a blasphemous cult. You ever heard someone refer to the church as a cult? The church of Christ, the church that belongs to Christ, as being a cult? He believed that. He believed that with his whole being, that this was some blasphemous group that was set to destroy the truth of Jehovah God. You look at the first couple of verses there, he goes to the high priest and he asks letters. What are those? What do you think those to be? We call it today arrest warrants. But he got multiple. Look at the words there. It's plural. He asked for letters to send to the synagogues there in Damascus. So Damascus had a large Jewish influence. synagogues were there, and there were multiple synagogues. Now, you put that in its perspective, you put that in its context. Why was he so vicious toward them? Because Christians were having an impact on his people. And where were they often preaching and converting people? Synagogues. You have a captive audience there, right? And so it made sense. They were going to preach Christ to them in those synagogues. So he wants these multiple letters, arrest warrants. It indicates that there were multiple synagogues there in Damascus, and these Christians had a strong influence on them, and he wanted to stop that. Now, going back to verse 1, he was breathing threats. He was breathing threats. If you go back to chapter 4 and verses 16 and 17, it's a very similar wording that's used there. Annas, the high priest, uses toward Peter and the apostles how they were preaching Christ, and he says we need to strongly threaten them that they don't preach this anymore. Did it work? And when I think about that, I'm emboldened and I'm encouraged when I see how those people of the first century, how those Christians, how this even says that they felt honored, in essence, to be counted worthy of persecution. I see how in Acts chapter 8, he's breathing out these threatenings, and there's great persecution that's coming to the children of Israel, the Christians in Israel, but they are scattered abroad and went everywhere preaching the gospel. And I have to ask myself a question. Growing up in this free nation in which we've grown up, most of us, we have been blessed with freedom of religion. And some of us have always been part of a strong Christian family, even been able to attend and worship with a strong Christian family in a congregation of the Lord's people. And I have to ask myself a question. What has my faith really cost me? Have I really ever really been persecuted? No, I honestly cannot say that. Especially not in light of reading texts like this and seeing what they went through, right? Somebody may have made fun of you, called you some names, and maybe once someone. I did go to do a study with a person once in Alabama, and we had one study with the lady. Come back the next time, and there was a man there, and he was very belligerent, and I didn't find out till I got back in the truck with my buddy that was with me that the guy had a gun. But I'm just talking to the lady like, I understand. He's a little intoxicated or something. He said, man, he had a big 357 sitting there. You didn't say this. No. But he didn't point it at me, so I still say I wasn't persecuted, right? But nevertheless, I look at this and I see how genuine faith looks, even in the face of persecution. They went everywhere preaching the gospel. When Peter was told, we're going to persecute you, we're going to put you in prison, we're going to beat you, he said, I'm going to preach the gospel. We cannot but speak the things which we see and hear. Truth. But Paul had a vendetta. He had this vendetta against them. He's breathing threats. Don Iverson, in his commentary on the book of Acts, made this comment about that idea of breathing threats. He said some liken it to a hungry animal when he begins to drool over the smell of his prey. That's how he was worked up. Paul was worked up. Saul of Tarsus was worked up. I'm going to stop these blasphemous cult. I'm going to put them in prison. And again, I go back and say, men and women. He didn't care. They've got to be stopped. That was his disposition. Were these idle threats? Were these just idle threats that he was throwing out? Absolutely not. Go over to Acts 26. Hold your place there in Acts 9. Acts 26. Paul would rehearse his conversion a couple of times. You have it in Acts 26. You have it in Acts 22. But look at Acts 26, verses 9 through 11. He says, I verily thought within myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem. And many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. And note this, when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. And I punished them all. Note again the personal pronoun. I did this. Now when he's saying these words, where was he? Converted. an apostle, preaching the gospel. What do you hear? I hear remorse, don't you? I'm ashamed of this. Ashamed that this is the way I treated them. I compelled them to blaspheme. And note this now. And being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto strange cities. Exceedingly mad against them. That word mad in the King James Version, the New American Standard Version, I believe the Old American Standard Version does it as well, says that he was furiously enraged. And it looked, we use that word mad, don't we, in our common language, that person's mad. Not just that they're angry. When we say they're mad, they've gone beyond angry. They're out of control. That's how he was toward this movement of Christianity. That's the man we're talking about. That's the one I hold in such high esteem. The Apostle Paul. The original word, the Greek word, has as its root a word that's mania, is spelled like mania, which we get our word what? Madness. The idea of madness. His disdain and his hatred toward Christianity was a madness. Out of control. Are you ready for it? Mental disorder. Like a mental disorder that he had no control over. Until he met Jesus. This was his vendetta. Is zeal a bad thing? Is zeal a bad thing? No. Of course not. Zeal's not a bad thing. But it has to be directed in the right direction. It has to be channeled. It has to be focused. As a matter of fact, I believe with my core that one of the reasons God chose Saul of Tarsus to be his apostle to the Gentiles was because part and parcel of his zeal. He just wanted to turn that zeal from where it was to where it needed to be. And that's exactly what happened. So that's his vendetta. But then we go from verses 3 through 9, there in Acts chapter 9, and we see Saul's vision. Saul's vision. It says, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise, go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man, but they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. He was there 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink. Couldn't we say Saul was blind long before he ever saw that light? In a sense, right? Saul was blind spiritually before he physically saw that light. Now, you picture in your mind this bright light shining from heaven, and that's the idea of the source behind it clearly. But you picture in your mind he's staring into that light. I can't take my eyes off of it until finally he has to close it. And even when he closed his eyes, he's still seeing Jesus. Even when he closed his eyes, he's still hearing and seeing what Jesus wants him to see and wants him to hear. We know that from the end of it, after the Lord stopped speaking to him, it says he did what? Opened his eyes, but he couldn't see. He opened his eyes, but he couldn't see. And it says, we go to the end there, and the idea, it's like scales that were on his eyes, like he had cataracts or something. He couldn't see. And the people that were with him, they heard a sound. They saw something going on. They couldn't see Jesus because he wasn't talking to them. He was specifically talking to Saul. They heard something, but they couldn't understand. Seeing Jesus and hearing his word opened his spiritual sight while blinding his physical sight. And what did he see? I'll go back to Acts chapter 7, the end of it, in Acts chapter 8. I go back to how he mentioned what we read over in Acts chapter 26 as he was rehearsing the things that he had done. When he said, Saul, Saul, why, what's that word? Persecutest thou me. You're jumping way ahead of me, brother. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? What do you think may have come? Now, this is going to be a little bit of opinion and conjecture, but what do you think came to Saul of Tarsus' mind when he heard that word persecute? Immediately. That was his mission. Guilty, absolutely. Do you think maybe he saw Stephen? I wonder if in that very moment, did he think, is this Stephen? Is Stephen coming back? Or maybe some other Christian, I don't know how many he had put to death, but maybe some other Christian that's coming back, and it hit him like a ton of bricks, didn't it? Now, some translations leave out the phrase there, trembling and astonished, in the question, what would you have me to do? But it fits the wording that Jesus said. As a matter of fact, if you worry about that, it shouldn't be in there. If you go over to Acts chapter 22 and verse 10, he tells us that he said, what shall I do? When Paul was rehearsing this. So, nevertheless, the idea is still true. Trembling and astonished fits. What did it say he immediately did when the light shined about him? He dropped to his knees. He fell down. He was staring into this light. So, who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus whom you persecute. Light illuminates, and Jesus is the ultimate illuminator, isn't he? We know that from John 8:24, John 9:5, John 12:46. Over and over again, he says he is the light. And he illuminates the way for us to do what? To reflect his light in our lives, to show his way to all those around us. Isn't that what Matthew 5, verse 16 is talking about? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. And do what? Glorify your Father in heaven. Saul was in Damascus for 3 days. 3 days, and he saw no man. But he couldn't help but see all that he had done and continue seeing Jesus. But of course, when we see Jesus by faith, we're forced to see ourselves for who we really are too, aren't we? That's what it's all about. Looking into the mirror of the soul, as it were. We study the Bible, we start seeing things that the Bible says, hey, Barry, you got to correct that. That's not right. That's what Jesus illuminates in us. You've got to make a change. You can't stay the same. Saul, you're persecuting me. That was his vision. I haven't done anything to you, Jesus. Yes, when you do it to the least of these. Didn't he say that in Matthew 25? You do it to me. When you don't do it to the least of these, you don't do it to me. Jesus is not disconnected from his people. If we're not connected to Jesus, we have to ask ourselves, are we truly his people? Yet just like Saul, Jesus sees what we can be. Not what we are in the moment, but what we can be. We're going to have to hurry. Saul's visit, that's verses 10 through 25. He sends Ananias to him, and we know it's not Ananias, the wife of Sapphira. Why? He died back in Acts chapter 5, right? He's the one that died. Ananias was a popular name in that day and age. But interesting, Ananias, we don't know a lot about him. Why didn't Jesus send Peter to him or one of the prominent apostles? Because that wasn't what it was about, was it? It wasn't about name recognition. Paul will address that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the division that they had in Corinth. Some saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. That's not the point. He would go on to say, I'm thankful that I didn't baptize any of you, say Crispus and Gaius, unless you say you were baptized in my name and exalting me in this. That's not the way it works. So that's a humbling thought for me as well. Ananias, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I've heard many things about this guy. He has a reputation. He persecutes us. Ananias, though, he was a team player. He definitely was a team player, and he was willing to go and listen to Christ. Now, interestingly enough, if you go to the text there and you look at how he speaks to the Lord, he gets this vision, and he says, this is verse 13, Ananias answered and said, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he hath done to the saints of Jerusalem, And here he hath what? Authority. Ananias is speaking to the ultimate authority, Matthew 28, verse 18, and describing the authority that Saul had. Do you think Jesus is concerned about the authority that Saul brought with those letters? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So Ananias was what? Well, he was afraid, but he wasn't too afraid. We know that because he went. He did what the Lord said. He couldn't see what Jesus could see because all he could see was the persecution. All he could see was what Saul had done, but Jesus saw the heart of Saul of Tarsus. And it would, of course, cost him greatly, as we already noted, what was going to do with Saul. It's going to cost him greatly. We read that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 26, how 5 times he was beaten. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was scourged. He was stoned. He was shipwrecked. All of those things that happened to him, and not to mention the care of all the churches that came upon him daily. It cost him a lot. His faith cost him a lot. But what do we see when we see Jesus telling us to visit the lost? Do we fear? Or better yet, what do we see when we're lost, needing visiting? Saul's validation comes in verses 26 and 27. Let's read those quickly. And when Saul was come to Jerusalem, he essayed to join himself to the disciples. But they were all afraid of him and believed not that he was a disciple, but Barnabas. That's a great 2 words right there. But Barnabas. What did he do? He took him, brought him to the apostles, declared unto them how he had seen the Lord in the way, how he had spoken to him, and how he preached boldly in Damascus in the name of Jesus. We can talk about many things about how difference one can make. We see examples of that in the Bible, but let's commit to being people like Paul who exemplify Christ. The Lord spoke to Paul. The Lord showed Paul that he can be more than he was. He became a great team player. Paul preached boldly, freely, fearlessly, and courageously in the name of Jesus. But doesn't our lives show that? It's something we can do, and that's what Paul is teaching us. That's what Jesus wants us to know. Be a team player. You are dismissed.